All right, just one more time. Went from a big denominational church to a full gospel, spirit moved church in search of God. So, my question still remains, where do we go from here? It's very difficult for me to think that with all the traditions, commands, and teachings of men, I wondered, is this it? Is this all we got? Is this all we have? And in my life, it was very difficult for me because I didn't know which way to go. I knew that big denominations didn't get it, and I knew if there was one thing the full gospel churches didn't have, and that is what I was searching for. And that's faith, to know God. So I sought these people who I thought knew God, but all they knew is what the person you're following knows: traditions and doctrines of men. Now, how is that going to help you in the time of need? These guys are pretending they have this great faith and they're telling you they can emulate the prophets of God, but yet, what do? Do they silence storms? Do they roll back plagues? Have you seen any of them go to the Middle East and talk to the leaders of these radical tribes and terrorists and ask them and command in Jesus' name to let the people go with this hand? They keep flowing out there, and just by the power of their words, they're saying, the power of my. I had one read a prophecy of a man who said, we're free of this pandemic. And then he goes on preaching like it's no big deal. Next day, preaching like it's no big deal. Worldwide ministry, jumps in a couple of his planes that he has, 4 or 5 planes, big house, huge bank account, and he is not held accountable. One thing we know is that if a prophet is a prophet of God, that when he says something, it comes to pass. But now we treat them like politicians. They make promises, and when they're elected, we never hear from them again. Same thing with a preacher. He prophesies things and we don't hold him accountable. He says things that desperate people need and we don't hold him accountable. He says them. I mean, he's got this spirit being moved, kind of his hand moving. This thing is a big thing with the hand gestures. But not God confirms nothing comes out of these freaks' mouths. They can prophesy prosperity and power, but they don't lift one finger to gain their prosperity. They don't say one thing that God confirms what they say, because God, number one, didn't send them, and God didn't fill their minds with what he has told them. And number 3 is it's just a bunch of malarkey, because what they say does not come to pass. And we let them off the hook time and time again. God would speak to you as he has spoken to me. Where Satan comes in the biggest temptations in our life is where God has spoken to us, girded us up by his spirit, not coming from the pulpit, but coming through the things in our life. Mine is adultery. Mine is spiritualism, false prophets, spiritualism. I was in a bookstore, and I'll recount this again and again. I was just married, and I've always felt God was drawing, on my life. So for some reason, I went to this bookstore of this book fair. This huge, I've never seen this auditorium as big as it was, with tables, hundreds of tables with books on these tables. And this was 37 years ago, 30, I remember like it was yesterday. I walked in the door, straight for the table. And remember, spiritualism has always been a big part of my life growing up. It helped destroy my mother's life, brought her into such confusion, disorientation. She didn't really know which way to go. So I head right for this book, and it had SATIN, and I innocently picked it up, opened it up, and it made an inference that Jesus was tempted by the spirit of a demon, Satan. Satan tempted him into the wilderness, and it's not true. He was drawn by the Spirit of God. But in the book, it was made an inference of Satan was tempting him to go into the wilderness. And as soon as I didn't read the whole sentence. This man, who I didn't notice when I walked up to the table, I guess he walked. I don't know how he got there, but he was to my right side, and he just lifted the book out of my hand. I think I had it in my right hand, and he just lifted the book out of my right hand and said, "You ought not to be reading that." Put it on the table. And I thought, wow, that's kind of weird. Strange. Here's this guy coming out of nowhere, yanking his book out of my hand, but yet, where's he from, man? What's this guy doing? And I didn't think to ask him any. I just walked away. I didn't think to ask him a question. So as I walked away, as I went from table to table in there with my wife, I was 22, 23. I looked up, and there he was. And I could tell who he was because he was wearing camouflaged. He was in the service. He was in the Army or the Marines or whatever. And he kept everywhere I went. He was there watching me. And I didn't think it was strange. It was a little coincidental. As I walked out the auditorium, there was hedges because, it was like hedges are like cones. They kind of a corridor to keep people moving out of this auditorium so they don't start scattering once they get out of it. So it's a hedge in these doors that come out. On either side of the doors come out to the left, up, and away you go. Well, as I'm walking out, this guy, of course, is walking behind me. I take 10, 5, 6 steps out of the door. He's walking behind me. And I look. He's headed toward the door. When I look, going out the door, when I look again, I don't see him. And again, it's God's warning to me of the spiritualism and the fact that I have to stay away from those things that is spiritualistic. Because in my life, that's a big temptation. My mother got in a cult of Chinese numbers, Ouija boards, fortune telling, spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on his fortune telling. It racked her brain up so much that these guys would prophesy houses and prosperity. It was sickening, sickening. what they did to my mother. And they always wanted cash, right? And it wasn't a good thing. And then Satan would tempt me in the same venue. And God warned me, stay away. And I know in your life, he's given you these same warnings, not to break his commands. And God knows where these commands, what these commands are for, and how Satan would come to tempt you, to distract you, to bring you into death and destruction. And you know where God has warned you. You know where you need to go or what you need to do. So when God says he sent his son, he did, to open our eyes to the wiles, the cunning schemes of the devil. He has. But he's delivered us from evil. He's ever faithful. And when he talks, we ought to listen. Sure, we have the commands and doctrines and testimonies of men. Sure, we have the different things in our lives that are testimony of these wonderful doctrines, that if they were true, my goodness, where would we be? Right? I mean, if they were true, we'd be the most sanctified, holy people on the planet. But the faith that God has, he's given to you. But you got so much clutter in your mind. You have so much fear and doctrines and traditions of men. It's fumbled around in your mind where you can't even have a thoughtful conversation, a thought when it comes to God. But he's delivered you. We're just following doctrines and commands of men.